All right. Welcome to the last week of Life Group resources for the year. I'm sure by this stage you really don't need me to remind you of what we've been talking about. Ross, thanks for joining us. We have pulled in the big gun for the final week. And the reason I've asked Ross to come and join us is because he was addressing the church staff on the Monday just before we shot this film for you around this interesting concept of ambition in the church. I'm going to ask him about it in a moment. But it paralleled so perfectly what we've been discussing over the last 7 weeks, because there is this strange thing that Jesus seems to appeal to our desires. He's not embarrassed about our desires. We're told to delight ourselves in the Lord and He'll give us the desires of our heart. And the desire that we've been speaking about most, Ross, is the desire for happiness, for a satisfying life. And Jesus keeps doing this strange thing of saying, I know you want to save your life. I know you want to have a happy life. So lose it. He appeals to our desires. He's not embarrassed about our desires. He doesn't tell us to shut them up. He actually fans them into flame, but then says you're going to have to do something you didn't ever expect to meet this desire. And what Ross ended up talking about was a perfect parallel of that, but not about the desire for happiness, but the desire to be first, the desire to win, which most of us are a little bit embarrassed that we have. But you were seeing that there's actually something that Jesus had to say that was super helpful. So maybe to start the convo, if you could tell us, what got you keen to have that conversation with the church staff in the first place? Why did we need to be re-envisioned around our ambition and this kind of holy idea of ambition? What got you started?
So in church world, in our staff especially, I see incredibly talented people, and they are competitive by nature, and they've got all of this drive, and they kind of feel embarrassed to have it. And they get into this, I don't feel like I'm humble, and so maybe I must just step back. And that almost, it cuts the legs underneath people who've been wired that way by God and got this incredible gift and strength. Now, obviously that can go awry, and that can all be about performance and identity and all that. But God has put inside of us a desire for progress. The instructions He always gives are true to our nature and true to the Spirit He's put inside of us. So when He says, go forth and multiply, go and increase this garden, it's because He's put it in there already. He's just calling it out. Yeah. And so I wanted to give direction to people who have something that is God-given and show them where to put that energy so that it doesn't hurt them and it serves people.
Cool. So as you said, it can go awry, it can come a bit of a Bogamina, all about me thing, or it can turn into this false humility. And I think probably we're all already believing you when you say there can be a godly version of ambition, but is there some scriptural example of how this can really look right and work well?
Yeah, so I mean, there are 3 scriptures around. There's Mark 9, it deals with it, Matthew 20, which I'll read in a moment, and Matthew 23. They all speak to this thing because Jesus consistently found Himself with people who wanted to be on His left and His right, wanted to be number one. He was exposed to ambitious people. And here's what He did with it. He redirected it. And so let me start off with Mark 9. And if you've been in church for a while, you would have heard this, but Mark 9:33 says, after they arrived at Capernaum and settled in a house, Jesus asked His disciples, what were you discussing out on the road? And I love this conversation because it just shows their level of maturity. And it says, but they didn't answer because they'd been arguing about which of them was the greatest. He sat down, called the 12 disciples over to Him and said, whoever wants to be the first must take last place and be the servant of everyone else. Now, He lived this, He taught it, He demonstrated it. In Matthew 20, He says the same thing. James and John's mom comes to Jesus, says, can my one son sit on your left, other son sit on the right? It's the kind of thing my mom would do. And Jesus, he basically says, can they drink the cup of suffering that I will drink? And they go, yes, of course we can. And they did. And Jesus, He acknowledged that they would follow Him in pain and in suffering for the cause of the gospel, for touching other people's lives. But then He ends this and He says, you know that the rulers in this world lord it over their people, and officials flaunt their authority over those under them. But among you it has to be different. Whoever wants to be a leader among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first among you must become your slave. For even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve others and to give His life as a ransom for many. So when I talk to personal ambition, and I have to talk to myself a lot because I'm fairly driven, I go, number one, personal ambition needs to be the presence of God. I have to, that relationship, my hearing God, my being filled with the Spirit, my being able to move with His presence guiding me, all of that has to be my number one. But my number two comes out of this, must be the servant of many. Some versions say the servant of all, or must serve everyone. And so when I think like that, I go, okay, how do I use what gifts I've got, what potential I've got, partner with the Spirit of God to serve as many people as possible? That is a good thing.
You said an amazing thing yesterday. I mean, firstly, it was the parallel that struck me, that Jesus didn't say it's wrong to want to be first. Hey, mom, stop getting into business that's not yours. He said, fine, if you want to be first, here's how. Yeah. Serve all. And then you said that when you serve people, it actually leads to more influence. And so often with all the stuff that we've seen over the last few weeks, when Jesus tells us to flip it on its head, it can sound a little hard at first. Man, that just sounds like a crazy ask, be the servant of all. But actually, He always knows what He's doing, and it often ends up being better for us, or it always ends up being better for us, sometimes soon, sometimes later. Have you seen that serving in this way is actually a more reliable route to promotion and influence than lording it over?
Yes, I mean, that's so good. Because if you have drive, you will find yourself wanting to be in every room you're not. And I see this again and again with people. They just, whenever they get exposed to a next level, they want to be in that room. Now, when you flip this on its head and go, servant of all, what begins to happen is you're concerned about the level you're at. And you want to do your best at serving in that space. And then when you go to the next level, you're invited into the next room, you're brought into that boardroom table. You know that that is a promotion from God to serve more people.
Yeah, I love that. So we're not working just when our boss's eyes are on us. We get to work as unto the Lord, serve all the time, and then we trust that when the promotion comes, it really was Him. Now, speaking of servant, you grew up the opposite of a servant. You were speaking about your upbringing, and you had a privileged upbringing, and people, many social rungs lower than you, around you, doing some serving, and at the same time were exposed to some incredibly wealthy, hugely successful, influential people. Talk to us a little bit about the role that your privilege and your exposure to very privileged people had in how you now do the servant of all thing.
Yeah. So growing up where my dad ran a game farm, what I said on Monday was that it wasn't what I had that was the privilege. The privilege was who I got to meet with. So people who came hunting on that game farm were very wealthy people. And the thing about wealthy people is often because they have wealth, they have resource, and that gives them opportunity, and it teaches them how to think in a different way. And so what you realize being around those people is they don't tolerate negative thinking. They're always thinking big. There's a clarity and a focus to their thought. And you get exposed to that enough and you start to think like that. And so it was an incredible gift to me. But what you do with that is the critical factor. So when I look at Scripture, God chooses Moses. He raises him up in Pharaoh's palace with big thinking. And then He uses that big thinking to serve slaves out of their slavery. And so wherever you have privilege, you have to see it as a serving tool to find people who God puts in your path or who God's given you influence over to serve out of their situation into life. And so that's the thinking.
Are we all privileged like that? I mean, maybe that was great for you, but I just grew up a poor church mouse. I didn't get to be exposed to sort of oligarchs on a game farm. What privilege does every believer have, if any? What resources do we have to serve a bunch of slaves who need us?
Yeah, so firstly, God doesn't make junk. So everybody has potential. And in that potential, most people have used it to some extent and have therefore read around it and studied around it and learnt around it. And therefore they know more than the next guy. And so just recognizing God made me like this, I'm going to develop myself in this area so that I can serve, puts you on a trajectory. that generally lands in a place of giving life. Now, I want to contrast that to the scripture that says one guy gets 5 talents, another guy gets 3, the guy that gets 1, he does nothing with it, buries it, and is called evil.
Yeah.
So here's the critical factor, is that a person who doesn't develop in an area of gifting that he has, whether it's a 1 talent, a 3, or a 5, is known as evil by God. And therefore, if we're sitting as Christians going, I don't have as much talent as that person, or I didn't get the privileged upbringing that Ross got, and I'm not using my 1 talent, I'm actually being evil. So I've got to use whatever I've got.
Yeah. You also mentioned that not just do I have all kinds of innate stuff that I mustn't bury in the ground, we've also been given this surpassing treasure of the scriptures, that we are the people of the book, as the Quran calls us, that even people who don't believe in Jesus realize we've got something powerful. How is that a resource to a sort of enslaved world?
Yeah. I mean, so that was my big idea for especially church staff. We study the scriptures, and we have the opportunity of teaching people the kingdom way of thinking. The kingdom way of thinking always works. It may go like that, it always works. And so we have this incredible gospel, and then we've got principles in scripture that will set enslaved people free. And so our advantage is huge. We have an unfair advantage on the rest of the world. It's our ability to recognize that and then apply it, which then becomes the testimony that earns us the right to serve them.
Interesting. You also mentioned that we get to bring hope, that's the other huge thing, that we don't just give principles that work, they do sow and you'll reap, tithe, it'll go well with you, honor your parents, you'll have a long life, like all that kind of stuff. We've got principles that work, but we also get to give hope. Yeah. Maybe just conclude talking into that. How does being ambitious with hope work? What does an ambitious kind of hope producer do?
So I heard someone else say this, that the person with the most hope has the most influence. Everybody wants hope. Recently we released that City Story video, and within a week 1,000 people had watched it because it was good news about Durban. Everybody wants to be around that hope person. Therefore, the scriptures are full of promise that give us hope. That hope, if internalized, becomes so attractive to people around you that you now have a voice to serve them. And so that just, again, it just gives us the unfair advantage to be more influential wherever we are and serve more people, which is the beauty of this gospel and Christianity that we represent.
Good stuff. Very helpful for a church staff. Thank you, Ross. That's awesome. I work at SPAR. What do I do with this? Talk a little bit to how this, if I want to be first, I'm going to be last, and being last looks like being servant of all, and I'm going to serve people with my God-given talent and the scriptures and hope and all this kind of churchy language. What does it actually look like Monday to Friday in the work world?
So what I see in people who understand that they have the hope of the gospel, they have all of that thinking, they understand that God's marked them with talent, and there's a calling on their life, is that they therefore take what they do a little more seriously, they do it a little more excellently, and that gives them a bit of a voice into the community around them. As they do stuff well, Scripture says, he who does things excellently or diligently will get a room with the king, basically. And so people who take their work seriously because of the gospel and because they want to be the servant of many will invariably be promoted into getting a voice with the people around them, because people around them will notice. And it may take time, but they will earn the right, whether it's in a corporate setting or in a business setting, or because their teaching is so good, or because that mom just consistently does the right thing with her kids. As they are shaped by this, they will find that God promotes them to have more and more voice. And that voice then serves people. And this is what we're called to do. And so every one of us can actually right now, today, look at where we're at, the people God's given us access to serve, and how God's working in us to make our message more one of hope. How we can embed ourselves in hope so that we can give life to people around us.
Okay, so it's time to get your ambition levels growing. Wherever they're at the moment, they need to get higher. We are not going to settle for false humility any longer and burying stuff under the ground and pretending, oh, I could never, that's far from, I'm not good enough. No, enough of that. So you're going to have a conversation about what natural passions has God put inside you. And Ross was saying how you don't want to bury that stuff. That would be evil. You want to fan it into flame, study around it, push yourself. What have you done with the gospel inside you as well, so that you get to serve people both with what you're good at and this amazing good news that you know, in a way that increases your influence? I think that if anything, we're hearing it's not evil to want more influence. In wartime, it makes the most sense that you would get as much influence as you possibly could to advance the kingdom. So that's the chat that you're going to have. And you might never have thought in ambitious ways before about the gospel. I'd like you to have permission to start to think that way now. So where's your influence? How are you going to grow it? Enjoy the conversation. Roscoe, thank you so much.